divisions within the abolitionist movement over the role of women and whether they should be subordinate or if it was appropriate for women to take more public or leadership roles in the movement. Many advocates of abolition and colonization held more traditional views on the role of women, claiming that women should play a supporting role in both the abolitionist movement and society and more generally. Women were often kept out of public, leadership, and decision-making positions, even though many of them were active in the abolitionist movement. For example, only 2 women attended the Agents Convention of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1836. The presence of women in the abolitionist movement was considered by many to be scandalous, not just because of the issue itself, but because these activists were women and the dominant expectation of the proper place for women was in the domestic, not the public sphere. The abolitionist movement became an occasion for white women to come out of the domestic sphere to work against the enslavement of others, while for black women was an opportunity to speak about their experience, bringing their story to the audiences to elicit empathy and action. White women had more freedom than black women to move about. They were more likely to have the income to support themselves while doing abolitionist work, while black women were at risk of capture and to transport to the South if someone alleged they were escaped slaves after the Fugitive Slave Act became effective in 1850. Women found their own ways to campaign as their actions were often not supported by men abolitionists. They wrote imaginative literature on slavery aimed at a wide readership. Former slaves such as Phyllis Wheatley wrote their own poems and accounts on their time as slaves that were extremely influential. Women wrote articles for abolitionist papers, circulated pamphlets, and delivered petitions to Congress calling for abolition. They also played an important role in organizing the sugar boycotts in the 1820s and 30s. They stopped buying slave-grown sugar and also refused to buy from bakers or shopkeepers who sold it. Women's involvement in the abolitionist movement changed drastically during the 1820s and 1830s. They began writing abolitionist essays in the 1820s, making women's roles much more visible in the anti-slavery struggle. By the next decade, American women led an array of abolitionist petition drives to state and federal governments, turning the anti-slavery cause itself into a hotly contested social matter. Many women such as Maria Stewart, Sojourner Truth, and Sarah Parker Raymond gave public speeches, but there are countless others who have received little recognition, and those whose names we might never know. Recognizing the need for anti-slavery society in which women could actively participate and contribute, Lucretia Mott, who helped founding the American Anti-Slavery Society, and 17 other women founded the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society in December 1833. This was the first time women had the opportunity to run an organization, but they quickly learned how to conduct meetings, prepare agendas, and conduct petitions. Women also played an active role in gaining public support for the campaign. In Birmingham, women's groups visited more than 80% of homes, persuading people to support the cause. They also paid for lecturers to give public speeches around the city. Many women involved in abolition became leaders in the women's rights and suffrage movements. Women involved in the early abolitionist movement also began to connect demands for equal right to their own lives experiences, advocating for expanded education, employment, and political rights, including suffrage. Both the abolitionist and the women's rights movements promoted the expansion of the American promise of liberty and equality, one to African Americans and the other to women. Many arguments used to advocate for women's rights came from experiences in the anti-slavery movement. For example, Angelina and Sarah Grimke of South Carolina were Quakers and effective anti-slavery speakers. However, they were criticized as it was considered improper for women to speak before promiscuous audiences comprised of both men and women.
The sexism that was present in the civil rights movement was a continuation of oppressive mentality that existed in the larger U.S. culture, which was and is a white male-dominated culture. Although both male and female activists campaigned for civil rights, women typically didn't receive the credit for their contributions and played for the most part background roles. Martin Luther King Jr. himself was recognized as a male chauvinist. The sentiment that a woman's primary role is as a homemaker or caretaker was shared by many other black leaders in the civil rights movement and the black community. Women often took background roles in the movement, such as preparing food, clearing up after the rallies, and training young activists. They registered voters by going door to door and led education campaigns. However, some of them also strategized campaigns, working alongside Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, and other civil rights icons. Women had leading position in local civil rights organization and began serving as lawyers on school segregation lawsuits. Many of the most iconic campaigns of the civil rights movement were coordinated by women, including nonviolent sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, forced integration of Central High School by the Little Rock Nine, and the voter registration drives of 1964. Most NAACP members and most local branch presidents were and still are women. Black community leaders recognized that without women, the NAACP would not exist. The person who was responsible for organizing their first meeting was a woman, and throughout the years, many women played key roles and were responsible for the evolution of the NAACP. Julian Bond, a civil rights historian at the University of Virginia and chair of the NAACP, stated that there's a Chinese saying, women hold up half of the world. In the case of the civil rights movement, it's probably 3/4 of the world. Many women that experienced gender discrimination and sexual harassment within the movement later turned towards the feminist movement in the 1970s, for which they employed the organization skills gained during the years of the civil rights movement. In the years since the movement, civil rights activist Rosa Parks has spoken publicly about the dangers of sexism. When she met Pope John Paul II in 1999, she shared these words with the pontiff. My lifetime mission has been simple, that all men and women are created equal under the eyes of our Lord. This simple sentence was Miss Parks' way of challenging women's secondary status in the Catholic Church. Miss Parks' story illustrates that, although sexism has limited the roles that women could play in the movement, their contributions were crucial. Further, her long-standing work for justice reminds us that many of the civil rights movement's female activists have continued the struggle against racial oppression and have gone on to combat multiple forms of oppression, sexism included.
Who are you?
I am a woman from the Abolitionist movement.
To which event did you take part?
I took part in the founding of the anti-slavery societies.
Were women recognized during the event?
Yes, one of the reasons so many anti-slavery societies were created was because their members disagreed on which role women should take within the anti-slavery societies.
Who's an important woman who took part in the event and what was her role?
One woman was Lucretia Mott, who founded the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society in December 1833.
Who are you?
I am a woman from the civil rights movement.
To which event did you take part?
I was a part of the March on Washington.
Were women recognized during the event?
No, us women were asked to stage a separate parade down Independence Avenue, and although countless women who played important roles in the movement could have spoken, only Daisy Bates was asked to give a speech, which lasted only 184 words.
Who's an important woman who took part in the event and what was her role?
Rosa Parks was very important. Sadly, she was not asked to give a speech, and many young people there didn't even know what she did for the movement during that time.
Overall, women's role in the abolitionist movement and in the civil rights movement were similar. In both movements, they were discriminated against because of their gender, not recognized for the role they played in the movement even though they were fundamental for its success. The main difference between women in the two movements is that the few women who were recognized in the abolitionist movement were mostly white, while in the civil rights movement, those recognized were mostly women of color.